Wait before you scroll away. You need to hear this. A billionaire collapsed in the middle of his own engagement party. Hundreds of guests froze. His fiancée didn't move toward him. She moved toward the cameras. But the maid on her knees beside him. She wasn't performing. She was praying. What happened in the next 60 seconds exposed a secret that no one, not even the billionaire, was fully ready for. Stay with me. This gets unbelievable. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Today's story is one of the most emotional, most twist-filled journeys we've ever told. A story about wealth, love, loyalty, and the quiet people the world overlooks. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll look at kindness a little differently. Let's begin. Nobody in that ballroom expected the night to end the way it did. Daniel Whitfield stood at the center of his own engagement party, surrounded by crystal chandeliers, imported orchids, and 300 guests who had all come to celebrate the joining of two fortunes. His father had built an empire in steel and real estate. His fiancée, Victoria Lane, came from old money in Connecticut, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and university libraries. On paper, it was the perfect match. Daniel was 34 years old, sharp-eyed, quiet in the way powerful men often are, the kind of quiet that made people lean in just to catch his next word. He had built his own tech company from nothing after his father's fortune had nearly collapsed in the 2010s, clawing his way back to billionaire status through sheer stubbornness. He didn't trust easily. He never had. Victoria, on the other hand, was radiant in every photograph, poised in every interview, effortless in every room she entered. She laughed at the right moments, touched Daniel's arm at the right moments, looked at him with adoring eyes whenever a camera was near. But something had been bothering Daniel for months. It wasn't one big thing. It was 100 small things. The way Victoria's voice changed when she spoke to waitstaff versus when she spoke to donors. The way she once told a valet, "Don't make me repeat myself," in a tone that made the young man flinch. The way she'd looked right through his housekeeper, Rosa Delgado, at a dinner party last spring, as if the woman standing 3 feet away simply didn't exist. Rosa had worked for the Whitfield family for 11 years. She had helped raise Daniel's younger sister after their mother passed. She knew how Daniel took his coffee, which chair he preferred in the study, and the exact way he liked his tie folded before an important meeting. To the rest of the world, she was invisible, just another woman in a uniform, moving quietly through mansions that weren't hers. But to Daniel she was family. That night, under the golden light of the Whitfield estate's grand ballroom, Daniel watched his fiancée work the room like a queen greeting her court. Reporters snapped photos. A string quartet played softly near the fountain. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne between guests who barely looked at them. And somewhere in the back of Daniel's mind, a plan had already begun to form. A plan he hadn't told anyone about. Not his lawyer, not his best friend, not even his own father. He needed to know, once and for all, who Victoria really was when she thought no one important was watching. He needed to know if she saw people or just used them. So at exactly 9:47 p.m., in the middle of his own engagement toast, with a glass of champagne raised high and 300 pairs of eyes on him, Daniel Whitfield let the glass slip from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor. And then, without warning, he collapsed. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Someone screamed. A woman near the dessert table dropped her plate. The string quartet stopped mid-note, bows frozen in the air. Daniel lay motionless on the cold marble floor. His blue suit sprawled across broken glass and spilled wine. His eyes closed, his breathing slow and shallow, exactly as he had practiced in front of his bathroom mirror 3 nights in a row. For a moment, the entire ballroom stood frozen, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Then Rosa moved. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. Still holding a tray of empty champagne flutes, she dropped it, glass shattering everywhere, and ran across the ballroom floor, her knees hitting the marble beside Daniel's head. Her hands went instantly to his neck, checking for a pulse, her voice sharp and urgent as she called for someone to phone 911. "Mr. Whitfield. Daniel, can you hear me? Someone call an ambulance now." Her hands were shaking, but her instincts were steady. She had learned CPR years ago, back when she worked nights at a nursing home before coming to work for the Whitfield family. She tilted his head gently, checked his airway, pressed 2 fingers against his wrist. And 3 feet away, in a flowing red gown that had cost more than Rosa made in a year, Victoria Lane stood completely still. She did not run toward her fiancé. She did not kneel beside him. She looked around the room first, at the guests, at the photographers, at the exact angle of the chandelier light, before she finally stepped forward. And what she said next, in a voice loud enough for the nearest 20 guests to hear, would change everything. "Get away from him. Don't touch him with those hands." The words cracked through the ballroom like a whip. Rosa froze, her fingers still resting against Daniel's wrist. Her whole body caught between the instinct to keep helping and the instinct to obey. She looked up at Victoria, confused, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ma'am, I'm checking his pulse, he needs." "You're going to embarrass this family," Victoria hissed, stepping closer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "The paramedics are coming. This isn't your job. Step back before you make this worse." A few guests near the front exchanged uneasy glances. Someone lifted a phone, recording quietly, uncertain whether to intervene. Rosa's hands trembled, but she didn't fully pull away. "He needs someone to keep him stable until help arrives. That's all I'm doing, I promise I'm not." "I said step back." Victoria's voice dropped lower now, colder, meant only for Rosa, though several guests standing close enough still caught every word. "You're the housekeeper. Act like it." The room seemed to hold its breath. For 11 years, Rosa had swallowed comments like this. She had learned, the way so many domestic workers learn, to keep her head down, to smile politely, to let cruelty slide off her like rain on a raincoat, because speaking up meant risking everything. Her job, her income, the small apartment she shared with her 16-year-old daughter Sophia, who was studying hard for a scholarship to nursing school. But something about this moment, her employer possibly dying on the floor in front of her, and his fiancée more concerned about appearances than his life, cracked something loose inside her. "With respect, ma'am," Rosa said, her voice shaking but clear. "Right now, he's a human being who might be dying. Not an employee. Not staff. Person. And you're worried about how this looks." Victoria's face flushed red, her eyes darting toward the nearest photographer, aware suddenly of how many people were watching, how many phones might be recording. "You don't understand," she snapped, quieter now, trying to regain composure. "This is his engagement party. Do you understand what this will look like in the papers tomorrow? The maid all over him on the floor." And there it was. Not fear for Daniel's life. Not panic. Not love. Just image. Just headlines. Just control. Beneath his closed eyelids, motionless on the cold marble floor, Daniel Whitfield heard every single word. He had wondered for months who Victoria truly was beneath the polished surface. He had told himself it was paranoia, that his trust issues were poisoning something good, that maybe he was pushing away a woman who genuinely loved him because his own father's failed marriages had taught him love always came with hidden motives. Now he had his answer. And it was worse than he had imagined. The ambulance sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder as they approached the estate's long gravel driveway. Rosa kept her hand pressed lightly against Daniel's shoulder, refusing to fully step away despite Victoria's glare, murmuring softly, "Stay with us, Mr. Whitfield. Help is almost here. You're not alone." Her voice was steady now, warm despite everything, the same voice she used when Daniel's sister had nightmares as a teenager, the same voice that had guided this family through funerals, through failures, through quiet nights when no one else was around. Victoria straightened her posture, smoothed her dress, and turned toward the gathering crowd with a practiced, controlled expression. The same expression she wore in charity photo shoots, the same expression that had graced magazine covers about America's most eligible power couples. "Everyone please give him space," she announced, her voice suddenly softer, performative, aimed at the room rather than at Daniel. "The paramedics will handle this. I'm sure he'll be fine." But her eyes never once dropped to check if that was true. The paramedics burst through the ballroom's grand double doors moments later, rushing toward Daniel with a stretcher, checking vitals, asking rapid questions. Rosa stepped back only when they insisted, her apron stained with spilled champagne and marble dust, her hands still trembling. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Daniel's eyes fluttered open for just a moment no one else noticed except Rosa, standing closest, watching carefully. Their eyes met. And in that brief, silent second, something passed between them that neither could yet explain. The ambulance ride felt like a blur of sirens, fluorescent lights, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor that, in truth, had never once shown any real danger. Daniel kept his eyes closed the entire way, letting the paramedics believe what everyone else believed. It wasn't until they wheeled him into a private examination room at St. Andrew's Medical Center, a hospital his own family had donated millions to over the years, that he finally opened his eyes and sat up. The paramedic nearly dropped his clipboard. "Mr. Whitfield." "I'm fine," Daniel said quietly, swinging his legs off the gurney. "I need you to do me a favor. Don't tell anyone I'm awake yet. Not the hospital staff, not my assistant, not my fiancé. I need 30 minutes. The paramedic, a young man named Marcus who had recognized Daniel's face from the news his entire adult life, hesitated, then nodded slowly, sensing something serious beneath the strange request. Daniel sat alone in the sterile hospital room, staring at his own hands, replaying Victoria's words over and over in his mind. "You're the housekeeper. Like it." The coldness in her voice hadn't been panic. It had been control, precise and practiced, the kind of cruelty that only surfaces when someone believes no consequence will ever follow. He thought of his father, a man who had built an empire and lost nearly everything twice, always saying the same thing at family dinners. "You'll never truly know someone's character until you see how they treat people who can't do anything for them." Daniel had spent 6 months quietly testing that theory with Victoria in small ways, noticing how she spoke to drivers, to waitstaff, to the cleaning crew at his office building. Small cracks had shown before tonight. But tonight had shattered the entire foundation. There was a knock at the door. It was Rosa. She stood in the doorway, still in her stained apron. Having refused to leave the hospital despite Victoria's assistant insisting she return to the estate to help manage the situation with the guests. Rosa had told the assistant quite firmly that she wasn't leaving until she knew Daniel was safe. When she saw him sitting upright, very much alive, very much not dying, her expression shifted from relief to confusion. "You're okay," she breathed. Then her eyes narrowed slightly, taking in his posture, the alertness in his face that didn't match a man who had just suffered a medical emergency. "Wait. You don't look like someone who just had a stroke." Daniel exhaled slowly, guilt creeping into his chest. "Because I didn't." Rosa's mouth fell open. "You didn't? What do you mean you didn't?" I faked it, Daniel admitted, his voice quiet and heavy with something between shame and clarity. I needed to know who Victoria really was. Not the version she shows in interviews. Not the version at galas. I needed to see what she'd do if she thought I might actually be dying, when there was nothing to gain from being kind. Rosa stood frozen, processing everything. The collapse, the champagne glass shattering, Victoria's sharp voice cutting through the ballroom. Her own instinctive rush to help a man who apparently hadn't needed help at all. You used me, she said slowly, hurt flickering across her face. You used all of us. Sophia is at home right now terrified because someone texted her that you almost died. Daniel's chest tightened. He hadn't considered that. Hadn't thought far enough beyond his own test to consider the ripple effects on the people who actually cared. Rosa, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed the truth. And did you get it? Rosa's voice cracked, somewhere between anger and exhaustion. Was it worth it? Watching a woman insult me in front of 300 people. Watching your family's name become a headline tomorrow. Daniel looked down at his hands again, ashamed. Yes. No. I got the truth I needed about Victoria. But I never meant for it to cost you anything. There was a long silence between them, filled only by the quiet hum of hospital machines in the hallway. Then Daniel said something that surprised even himself. You were the only person in that entire ballroom who acted like a human being instead of an actor in a play. Everyone else froze or filmed or worried about optics. You just helped. Without thinking twice. Rosa wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by her own emotion. That's not a twist, Daniel. That's just decency. It shouldn't be rare. But it was rare. And they both knew it. Outside in the hallway, unnoticed by either of them, Victoria had just arrived at the hospital. Heels clicking rapidly against the tile floor, already rehearsing what she would say to reporters waiting outside. She had no idea the man she was about to see was more awake, more aware, and more changed than she could possibly imagine. Victoria swept into the hospital's private wing like a storm dressed in silk, trailed by her publicist, her assistant, and a small security detail hired to manage the growing crowd of reporters outside. She had already rehearsed her statement in the car, something about gratitude for prayers, resilience, love conquering fear. She hadn't rehearsed what she found instead. When she pushed open the door to Daniel's private room, expecting to see him hooked to monitors, pale and fragile, she instead found him sitting fully upright on the edge of the hospital bed, dressed, alert and calm, with Rosa Delgado standing quietly beside him, her apron still stained from the night's chaos. Daniel! Victoria's voice wavered between confusion and relief. You're okay. What happened? The doctors said. There was nothing wrong with me, Victoria, Daniel said evenly. His voice steady in a way that unsettled her more than any accusation could have. I collapsed on purpose. The color drained from Victoria's face. What? I needed to see something, he continued. I needed to see who you really are when you think the cameras aren't the priority. When you think it's just about me, about whether I live or die. Victoria's publicist shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, suddenly very interested in her phone. That's insane, Victoria said, forcing a laugh that came out thin and brittle. You scared me half to death for some kind of test? Daniel, that's manipulative, that's. You called Rosa the help while I was on the floor, Daniel interrupted quietly. You told her to get her hands off me because it would look bad in the papers. You didn't ask if I was breathing. You asked how it would photograph. The silence that followed was suffocating. Victoria's eyes flicked toward Rosa, sharp and accusing, as though searching for someone to blame that wasn't herself. She's exaggerating. I was in shock, Daniel, anyone would have. There were 300 witnesses, Daniel said. And at least a dozen phones recording. I've already seen 2 clips online. Would you like to watch them together? Victoria's confident posture faltered for the first time since she'd entered the room. Her publicist cleared her throat awkwardly and stepped further into the hallway, clearly unwilling to be part of whatever was unfolding. I panicked, Victoria said finally, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier polish. I said something I shouldn't have. People say things they don't mean when they're scared, Daniel, you know that. Maybe, Daniel said quietly. But 11 years of small comments, small dismissals, small cruelties toward people who serve you, that's not panic, Victoria. That's a pattern. Tonight just happened to have witnesses. Rosa stood quietly by the window, uncomfortable being present for such an intimate unraveling, yet unable to leave without seeming to abandon Daniel in this moment either. Victoria turned toward her suddenly, desperation flashing across her expression. Rosa, please tell him I'm not like that. Tell him I've always been kind to you. Rosa hesitated, torn between honesty and the awkwardness of being pulled into a conflict that wasn't hers to referee. But she had spent 11 years learning that silence often protected the wrong people. You've never once asked me my daughter's name, Rosa said softly. Not once, in 3 years of visiting the estate. But you remember every guest's allergy at your dinner parties. I'm not trying to hurt you, ma'am. I'm just telling the truth. Victoria's carefully constructed composure finally cracked completely. Tears welled in her eyes. Though even now, Daniel found himself wondering whether they were tears of genuine remorse or tears born from the sting of being exposed. I need you to leave, Victoria, Daniel said gently but firmly. I think we both know this isn't going to work anymore. You're ending our engagement over one bad moment. Victoria's voice rose, panic creeping back in. After everything, the families, the merger, the wedding plans, the press already announced. I'm ending it, Daniel said, because tonight showed me exactly who you are, and exactly who you're not. And I can't spend the rest of my life with someone who sees kindness as weakness and cruelty as control. Victoria stood frozen for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, any opening to argue her way back in. She found none. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heels echoing sharply down the hospital corridor. Her publicist scrambling to catch up, already whispering about damage control. The door clicked shut. And in the sudden quiet, Daniel let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for months. The next morning, the story had already exploded across every major outlet in the country. Billionaire fakes stroke to test fiancé. What she said shocks the internet. Whitfield heir calls off engagement after viral ballroom video. The maid who ran toward him while everyone else ran for cameras. Clips from the ballroom had spread overnight, viewed millions of times, dissected in comment sections across every platform. Some praised Daniel's unconventional method of learning the truth. Others criticized him harshly for manipulating an entire room of people, for putting Rosa through unnecessary trauma, for turning a genuine emergency simulation into public spectacle. Daniel read every comment. He didn't defend himself. He knew deep down that both things could be true, that he had learned something vital, and that he had also caused real harm in the process, especially to Rosa and her daughter. He called Rosa that afternoon. His voice quieter than usual. I owe you an apology. Real one. Not just for last night, but for putting you in that position without ever considering what it would cost you and Sophia. There was a long pause on the line. Sophia cried for 20 minutes thinking you died, Rosa said finally. Then she cried again when she found out it wasn't real, because she said it felt like being lied to by someone she trusted. The words landed like a weight in Daniel's chest. I'd like to meet her, Daniel said carefully. Not to explain myself. Just to apologize directly. If that's all right with you. Rosa hesitated, but something in Daniel's voice, the humility in it, so different from the polished confidence he usually carried, made her agree. 2 days later, Daniel arrived, without any assistance, without any cameras, at the small 2-bedroom apartment Rosa shared with her daughter in a modest neighborhood 40 minutes from the Whitfield estate. It was the first time in his life he had visited an employee's home. Sophia opened the door cautiously, 16 years old, sharp-eyed, clearly still processing the whirlwind of the past few days. She had grown up hearing stories about the Whitfield family from her mother. Mostly good stories, occasional complaints about long hours, but nothing that had prepared her for meeting the man himself standing awkwardly in their doorway holding a small bouquet of flowers. "I'm sorry," Daniel said simply before anything else. "What I did scared you. That wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, regardless of what I was trying to learn." Sophia studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, clearly her mother's daughter in her steady, unflinching gaze. "You know what's crazy?" she said finally. "My mom has worked for rich families her whole life. She's cleaned floors, cooked meals, raised other people's kids while barely seeing me grow up sometimes. And not one of them has ever shown up at our door to apologize for anything." Daniel absorbed the words quietly, letting them sit without defense. "She talks about you differently than the others though," Sophia added, softening slightly. "She says you're the only one who ever remembered her birthday without being reminded by an assistant." Rosa, standing behind her daughter in the small hallway, felt her cheeks flush with embarrassed surprise that Sophia had shared that detail. Daniel smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd allowed himself in days. "Your mother has taken care of my family for 11 years. The least I can do is remember small things about hers." They talked for nearly an hour that evening, not about billionaires or engagements or viral videos, but about ordinary things. Sophia's dream of becoming a pediatric nurse. Rosa's years working nights before joining the Whitfield household. Daniel's own complicated relationship with his late mother, who had died when he was only 19, leaving him unsure how genuine affection was even supposed to look. For the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel like a billionaire being courted for his money or his name. He simply felt like a man, sitting in a small living room, being honest with people who had no reason to perform for him. And somewhere in that quiet, unremarkable evening, something inside him began to shift. Word of Daniel's visit to Rosa's apartment eventually reached the press, though not through any deliberate leak. A neighbor had recognized him arriving and posted a blurry photo online with the caption, "Is that the Whitfield billionaire visiting his housekeeper's apartment?" The internet, already captivated by the scandal, seized on the new development with even greater intensity. Some speculated a hidden romance. Others accused Daniel of using Rosa for positive publicity to repair his image after the engagement scandal. A few tabloids ran cruel headlines questioning Rosa's motives, insinuating she had somehow orchestrated the entire situation for financial gain, an accusation that devastated her far more than anything Victoria had said in the ballroom. Rosa found herself unable to sleep one night, scrolling through comment after comment questioning her integrity. Her character, 11 years of quiet, honest work reduced to speculation about gold digging. She called Daniel the next morning, her voice tight with exhaustion and frustration. "I need this to stop. I have a daughter who reads these comments. I have a job, a life, people who knew me before any of this happened. I can't be part of your redemption story, Daniel. That's not what I signed up for." Daniel listened carefully, guilt washing over him again. He had underestimated repeatedly how deeply his choices rippled outward into lives that hadn't asked to be part of his personal reckoning. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'll issue a statement clarifying everything, that my visit was purely an apology, nothing more, and that the speculation is baseless and unfair to you and Sophia." True to his word, within hours Daniel released a carefully worded public statement, taking full responsibility for the fabricated collapse, acknowledging the harm it caused, and firmly asking the media and public to leave Rosa and her family out of unfounded speculation. He didn't mention any romantic angle because in truth there wasn't one. Not yet, not in any way either of them had consciously acknowledged. The statement helped somewhat. The speculation didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, redirected mostly toward broader conversations about class, wealth, and how differently people treat those they consider beneath them versus those they consider useful. Meanwhile, Victoria Lane had not gone quietly. She gave an exclusive television interview a week later, sitting elegantly across from a well-known daytime host, describing herself as blindsided, humiliated, and manipulated by a man who staged a medical emergency for his own twisted psychological experiment. "He tricked an entire room of people," she said, dabbing carefully at dry eyes with a tissue. "I said something I regret in a moment of shock, and now I'm being painted as some kind of villain, while he gets to play the hero for visiting his own housekeeper." The interview reignited public debate. Comment sections split fiercely, some sympathizing with Victoria's point about Daniel's manipulation, others pointing out that her cruelty toward Rosa had been consistent, deliberate, and unmistakably clear in the footage, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. Daniel watched the interview alone in his study late that night, feeling no satisfaction in her public struggle, only a heavy, complicated exhaustion. He had wanted the truth. He had gotten it. But truth, he was quickly learning, rarely arrived clean or without collateral damage. His father called him that evening, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You did something reckless, son. But you learned something real. Now the question is what you do with it. Do you become bitter and guarded forever? Or do you actually change?" Daniel sat with that question long into the night, staring out at the estate grounds where, just over a week ago, an entire engagement party had unraveled in front of hundreds of witnesses. He thought of Rosa's steady hands checking his pulse. He thought of Sophia's unflinching honesty in her small apartment doorway. He thought of Victoria's sharp voice, more concerned with headlines than his life. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand exactly what kind of man he wanted to become. 3 weeks passed before Daniel worked up the courage to see Rosa again, not as an apology this time, but simply because he missed the easy honesty of that evening in her apartment, a kind of honesty he realized he had rarely experienced in his adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. He didn't show up unannounced this time. He called first, awkwardly, almost nervously, asking if he could take her and Sophia to dinner as a proper thank you, nothing more. Rosa hesitated. She was still cautious, still protective of her daughter, still aware of how quickly public perception could turn cruel again if photographed together in the wrong context. "Somewhere quiet," she finally agreed. "Nothing fancy. Nothing that ends up online." They chose a small family-owned Mexican restaurant in Rosa's neighborhood, the kind of place with mismatched chairs, handwritten specials, and a grandmother in the kitchen who greeted every regular customer by name. Daniel arrived alone, without security, dressed down in jeans and a plain jacket, doing his best to blend into a world he rarely occupied. Dinner was simple, warm, unpretentious. Sophia peppered him with curious questions about running a company, about whether being a billionaire was as exciting as movies made it seem. Daniel found himself laughing more freely than he had in months, admitting honestly that most of his days involved spreadsheets, difficult meetings, and far less glamour than people assumed. Rosa watched the exchange quietly, noticing something in Daniel she hadn't fully seen before. Not the polished, guarded businessman from magazine covers, but someone genuinely trying, awkwardly and imperfectly, to connect with people as equals rather than employees. After Sophia excused herself to the restroom, an easy silence settled between Daniel and Rosa. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said quietly. "That night when you ran toward me, you didn't hesitate for even a second. Why?" Rosa considered the question carefully before answering. Because that's what you do when someone might be dying, Daniel. You don't calculate the optics. You don't think about how it looks. You just help. It's not complicated. It should be that simple, Daniel said. But in my world, it rarely is. Everyone calculates something: advantage, image, leverage. I've spent so long surrounded by that. I forgot what it looked like when someone acted purely out of instinct and care. Rosa smiled softly, a little sadly. That's a lonely way to live. It has been, Daniel admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. Watching you that night reminded me that some people still exist without an agenda. I didn't realize how much I needed to see that until it happened. Their conversation drifted into quieter, more personal territory. Rosa's late husband, who had passed away from a heart condition when Sophia was only 7, the years of working multiple jobs to keep their small apartment, the quiet pride she felt watching her daughter grow into someone determined to help others through nursing. Daniel listened intently, aware of how different Rosa's life had been from his own, yet struck by how much more grounded, how much more genuinely rich it felt in ways his own privileged upbringing never had. By the time Sophia returned to the table, something subtle had shifted between Daniel and Rosa. Not romantic, not yet, but something deeper than employer and employee, something closer to genuine mutual respect and quiet understanding. As they said goodbye outside the restaurant that evening, Rosa looked at Daniel carefully. You know this can't become some tabloid fairy tale, right? Billionaire falls for the housekeeper. Real life isn't a movie. Daniel smiled, a little wistfully. I know. I'm not looking for a fairy tale, Rosa. I'm just grateful to know someone who's real. Rosa nodded, satisfied with that answer, and turned to walk Sophia home through the quiet evening streets, unaware that Daniel stood watching them for a long moment before finally returning to his car. A small, unremarkable moment that neither of them realized would matter far more in the months ahead than either could yet imagine. 6 months passed. Daniel Whitfield's company underwent a series of quiet but significant changes. Inspired by everything that had unfolded, he launched an internal initiative ensuring fair wages, healthcare benefits, and paid family leave for every household staff member employed across his family's properties, a policy virtually unheard of among America's wealthiest families. He personally funded a scholarship program for children of domestic workers, an initiative that, without any public announcement, quietly helped cover Sophia's tuition as she began her first semester of nursing school. The scandal from that engagement night gradually faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories, newer controversies, the endless churn of a news cycle that rarely lingers long on any single event. Victoria Lane, meanwhile, had rebranded herself in the months following, appearing at charity galas with a new fiancé, another wealthy heir whose family had made their fortune in shipping. Daniel wished her no ill will. He simply felt, watching her occasional public appearances, a quiet gratitude that he was no longer part of that particular performance. His relationship with Rosa had evolved slowly, carefully, without the dramatic urgency of a movie romance. They had dinner occasionally, always quietly, always without press attention. Rosa remained cautious, protective of her privacy and Sophia's, unwilling to rush into anything that might expose her daughter to renewed public scrutiny. But something had undeniably grown between them, a friendship built on honesty rather than performance, respect rather than obligation, care rather than convenience. It was Sophia, unsurprisingly blunt as always, who finally addressed it directly one evening at dinner. You two realize you like each other, right? Like actually like each other. Not just, thank you for saving my life like each other. Rosa flushed, embarrassed, while Daniel laughed awkwardly, neither denying nor confirming the observation. It's complicated, Rosa said finally. There's still so much difference between our worlds, Sophia. It's not that simple. "Mom," Sophia said, rolling her eyes with the particular exasperation only a teenager can summon. "You ran toward a dying billionaire without thinking twice, and he flew across the country just to apologize to us in person. I don't think simple has ever been part of this story." Daniel smiled quietly at that, appreciating the young woman's directness more than she probably realized. Later that evening, walking Rosa home under the soft glow of streetlights, Daniel finally allowed himself to say what he'd been carefully avoiding for months. "I don't want you to feel any pressure," he said carefully, "and I understand completely if the answer is no, given everything, the attention, the complications, the differences in our lives. But I care about you, Rosa. Not because of what happened that night, but because of who you've continued to be every single day since." Rosa stopped walking, studying him carefully under the dim streetlight, weighing years of caution against something quieter and more hopeful stirring beneath the surface. "I've spent my whole life taking care of other people's families," she said softly. "I never let myself imagine being part of one in a different way. Scares me, Daniel. Not you, just everything that comes with you." "I'm not asking for certainty," Daniel said gently. "Just the chance to figure it out honestly, without agendas, without cameras. The way you showed me that night in the ballroom, when you didn't hesitate to help someone, even though it cost you something." Rosa smiled, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the strange, quiet relief of being truly seen after so many years of being overlooked. "Okay," she said finally, softly. "Let's figure it out. Honestly." Their relationship, when it finally became public nearly a year later, unfolded nothing like the tabloid fantasy the internet had once imagined. There was no grand announcement, no staged photo shoot, no dramatic press conference. Instead, a local news outlet simply photographed Daniel and Rosa attending Sophia's nursing school pinning ceremony together, sitting quietly among other proud families, clapping enthusiastically as Sophia received her credentials. The photo went mildly viral, reigniting brief interest in their story, though the tone this time felt notably different from the scandal-driven headlines of the previous year. Many commenters expressed genuine warmth, moved by the quiet, unforced nature of their relationship, so different from the calculated image Victoria had once projected. Rosa continued working, though not as household staff any longer. At Daniel's encouragement, and after months of her own careful consideration, she had used part of her savings, along with a small business loan Daniel insisted on structuring as strictly professional rather than personal, to open a small home healthcare service, employing several former colleagues from her years working in private households, women who understood intimately the value of genuine attentive care. Daniel, meanwhile, continued expanding his company's fair labor initiatives, occasionally speaking at business conferences about the importance of treating every employee, regardless of position, with dignity and respect. Lessons he freely admitted he had learned the hard way, through public humiliation and painful self-reflection rather than natural inclination. Sophia, now a licensed nurse working in pediatric care exactly as she'd dreamed, often joked that her mother's viral moment of kneeling beside a dying billionaire had accidentally become the origin story of their family's new life. "Best resume boost in history," she'd tease. "Mom saved a billionaire's life and got a nursing scholarship out of it." Rosa always laughed at that, though privately she knew the truth ran deeper than any convenient origin story. It wasn't the collapse itself that had changed everything. It was the choice she made in that single unthinking moment, the choice to act with compassion rather than calculation, regardless of consequence. One quiet evening, nearly 18 months after that chaotic engagement party, Daniel sat with Rosa on the small porch of the modest home they had recently begun sharing, a home considerably smaller than the Whitfield estate, chosen deliberately by both of them, a place that felt lived in rather than performed. "Do you ever think about that night?" Daniel asked, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft orange hues. Rosa nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Mostly I think about how strange it is that the worst moment of my professional life, being humiliated in front of hundreds of people, ended up leading to the best chapter of my personal life. Daniel reached for her hand, quiet gratitude settling over him. I never planned any of this, you know. I just wanted the truth about Victoria. I never imagined the truth would also show me something about myself, about who I actually wanted to become. Rosa squeezed his hand gently. Sometimes the truth doesn't just expose people, Daniel. It reveals possibilities you never let yourself consider. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence built not on performance or obligation, but on genuine, hard-earned trust. 2 years after that fateful engagement party, Daniel Whitfield stood once again in a room filled with family, friends, and quiet anticipation. Though this time the room was far smaller, the guest list far more intimate, and every single person present had been personally chosen, not for status or headlines, but for genuine relationships built on honesty. Rosa walked down a simple garden aisle in a modest ivory dress. No elaborate ballroom, no chandeliers, no press cameras waiting outside. Sophia stood proudly as her mother's maid of honor, tears streaming unashamedly down her face as she watched two people who had built something real out of the wreckage of a very public, very painful truth. Daniel's father, watching from the front row, leaned toward a nearby relative and murmured quietly, "You know, I always told him you never really know someone's character until you see how they treat people who can't do anything for them. I just never imagined that lesson would lead him here." As Daniel took Rosa's hands beneath a simple wooden arch decorated with wildflowers, he thought back to that chaotic night. The shattered champagne glass, the gasping crowd, Victoria's cold, calculated words, and Rosa's instinctive, selfless rush to help a man she believed was dying, expecting nothing in return. He thought about how easily that single ordinary act of compassion had exposed not just Victoria's true character, but his own blindness, his own assumptions about love, wealth, and worth. "I used to think love needed to look impressive," Daniel said quietly during his vows. His voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath it. Grand gestures, perfect optics, flawless appearances. "But you taught me love actually looks like kneeling beside someone in broken glass, without hesitation, without calculation, simply because they need help. You taught me that real worth has nothing to do with status, and everything to do with character." Rosa, tears in her eyes, squeezed his hands gently. "I spent 11 years believing I was invisible in rooms like the one where we met," she said softly. "You reminded me that sometimes the people who seem invisible are the ones who see everything most clearly." As the small crowd applauded softly, wildflowers scattered gently in the evening breeze, Sophia watched with quiet pride, knowing that her mother's 11 years of quiet, thankless dedication had finally, unexpectedly, been fully seen and deeply valued. The story that had once dominated headlines as a scandal about wealth, manipulation, and public humiliation had transformed, slowly and honestly, into something far more powerful. A story about the quiet dignity of genuine kindness, the painful cost of exposing hidden cruelty, and the unexpected beauty of love built not on performance, but on truth. And that's the story of a billionaire who faked a stroke to learn the truth, and found something far more valuable than he ever expected. The lesson here is simple, but powerful. Character isn't revealed in comfortable moments. It's revealed in crisis, in chaos, in the split-second choices people make when they think no one important is watching. Kindness that expects nothing in return is the rarest, most valuable trait a person can carry, and it deserves to be seen, honored, and celebrated. If this story touched your heart even a little, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you want more emotional, real, powerful stories like this one every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that genuine kindness always matters, please share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.